I think we all understand at this point that a lot of Americans have become pretty radicalized, and even more are worried about how partisan, how extreme, and how predisposed to violence our politics have become. But the polls demonstrating what people think about what's going to happen in America are getting even more radical at an amazing pace. So I want to jump into some of the results of a recent poll summarizing a number of different things. The top line to focus on is that 2 in 5 Americans believe a civil war is at least somewhat likely in the US within the next decade. So, like, by the time the LA Olympics happen, we might be engaged in a civil war. That's what 40% of the country actually thinks. But they believe that other things are far more likely, that the U.S. will no longer be a global superpower. I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't really care. That there will be a total economic collapse. 47% of the country thinks that. Total economic collapse. Now, I don't know what each individual person, how they define that, but that is an extreme stance, and they think that it's coming. That there will be a civil war between people who are Republicans and Democrats. A very high percentage think that that's possible. That the U.S. will no longer be a democracy. A total breakdown of law and order. I don't know what some people mean when they say those things, but this clearly shows that there's a lot of fear out there. And so what do they think the nature of this will be? Well, 40% think that there is likely to be a civil war. 32% think it's likely between red and blue states, as if, to define a state as red and blue defines truly what they are. No, there are blue people in red states and red people in blue states. And so that's going to be messy, I think. 30% think it's likely between the rich and the poor. 29% think it will be a race war. 20% think it's likely between people living in cities and rural areas. So depending on who you ask, they might be worried about a different sort of war, but many are worried about it in general. By the way, 39% think that we won't be a democracy. And that's worrisome. And by the way, I understand the concern. Look at what happened on January 6th. It came pretty close. And, legally, the Republicans have done a lot to make it more likely that that sort of thing could work. So if you're worried about that, I get it. But when you dive a little bit deeper than that, the results, I think, are maddening. So if we lose our democracy, if we fall to some sort of dictatorship, what form will it come in? Well, slightly more think the U.S. will become a fascist dictatorship, 31%, than say it will become a communist dictatorship, 21%. And by the way, they note that they haven't asked if people think that this has already happened, so that number might even be higher. But let's pause for a second there. 21% of the country thinks that the U.S. within a decade will be a communist dictatorship. How do you even respond to that? The idea that American democracy can die has become all too real. I get if people are worried about that. Who the hell is going to launch this communist dictatorship? Who's going to be the head of it? What section of the American public is desperate for a communist form of government? I understand there are some communists. I think even they would say they're very pessimistic about it becoming even like a subset of the Democratic Party or a third party, let alone that the entire country will be taken over it. That is insane right-wingers. That's all that is. I don't even know if they mean it when they say that it's going to happen, but they definitely want you to think they're terrified of that. Now, the idea that if we fell into a dictatorship that it would be fascist in nature, I think that's fairly indisputable at this point. Whether it will happen or not is a much more interesting question. But the idea that it's going to be a communist dictatorship, we live in a country where at least 1 out of 5 people are absolutely out of their mind. And not just about QAnon and pedophiles and stuff. That is madness. Anyway, 2/3 of Republicans think that total economic collapse is at least somewhat likely. Only 38% of Democrats. So for all I know, that's just Republicans saying Biden's in charge and so things will be bad. I don't know. But that's what they're saying. Around half of Republicans say it's likely that the government will confiscate citizens' firearms. Only 17% of Democrats say this. And this is an area where not having the political bias makes it possible for you to distinguish reality from fantasy. The idea that the U.S. government is going to confiscate firearms in a country that has over 300 million firearms is, again, sheer madness. There is no reasonable, rational argument to be had with a person who thinks that. And the thing is, it is one thing for 48% of Republicans to think that it's going to happen now. These people have thought it would happen for literally decades at this point. Election after election after election, they say, we got to stop these Democrats because they're going to steal our guns. They're doing all these false flags so they can steal our guns. When are they going to get around to actually stealing the guns? Why has the government been faking mass shootings for literally decades as a pretense to steal guns, and then, aw shucks, they just keep forgetting to do it? It's a really incompetent communist dictatorship that we have ruling America right now. And yet, this is convincing to 48% of Republicans. Republicans are more likely to think that there will be a complete breakdown of law and order, 49% versus 31%. That's not as big of a gap. That just means, again, Biden's in charge, and so the criminals are going to be able to take over. 41% of Republicans think the U.S. will be invaded by a foreign country. What? 41%? Do you know what that means? 41% of roughly half of people think that. If you stand in line at the supermarket, there's a good chance at least one person there thinks that the U.S. within the next decade is going to be invaded by another country. I would love to ask a follow-up question. Which country is going to invade our country, which spends the better part of $1 billion a year on defense, that possesses literally thousands of nuclear weapons, thousands of tanks, countless planes, countless ships? What is it, Canada? Mexico? Colombia? France? Who do you think is going to invade our country in the next decade? That's 41%. We should spare a second for the 24% of Democrats think that that's going to happen. That's crazy too. Who the hell is going to invade us? And so look, I'm interested in every one of these details and more. I wish we could dive into each one of them for 10 minutes. But overall, the picture that's being painted here is that we are surrounded by a lot of crazy people who believe a lot of crazy things. And what are we trying to do in the meantime? We're trying to get these crazies to just pay attention to reality for a few minutes. So, I don't know, people can have health insurance, or we can relieve a little bit of the burden of student loan debt. I don't know, maybe we can get some lead out of the water. We can do something to stop climate change. We're trying to do substantive, concrete things to improve the quality of life of millions of Americans, whether we agree with those Americans politically or not. And in the meantime, we've got roughly 100 million chickens with their heads cut off running around talking about how black helicopters are out there and the country's going to be segmented in different regions and then they're going to be pitted against each other and Bill Gates is going to put a chip in your brain. It makes our job a little bit more difficult. And this is a reminder of the task ahead of us. There's so much more. I wish we could jump into concerns about different types of extremism. We just don't have the time. I will leave you, though, with a positive message. While obviously, if you ask Democrats or Republicans about what sort of extremism they're worried about, you'll be surprised to find out that they very much disagree. This is graphic 7. But what I can say is that while most people seem to agree that white supremacist extremism is the biggest issue, and certainly Democrats believe that, did you know that 43% of Republicans are at least somewhat worried about white supremacist extremism? And considering that those are the sorts of groups that have been committing mass shootings and, organizing, trying to set up a race war, talking about kidnapping governors, it should be higher. But the fact that nearly half of Republicans acknowledge that it's sort of an issue, that's not the impression that I get from the news. It's not the impression I get from Fox News. And so that is a little bit of good news that I will leave you with.